The bells of St. Patrick's old cathedral rang out across Mulberry Street, low and mournful, the way old church bells do when they've been ringing for 200 years and have seen every kind of wedding, funeral, and secret in between. Inside the vestibule, Eliana Russo pressed her palms against the cold marble counter and tried to remember how to breathe. Her sage green work dress strained slightly across her hips, the silk warm from her nervous body heat, and her dark curls, pinned into a soft chignon, were already beginning to slip free. She was 26 years old, a florist by trade and by inheritance, and she was about to walk down the aisle of the most infamous cathedral in Manhattan, carrying a cascade of white peonies for 400 of the most dangerous, wealthy, whispered-about guests in the city. She had never wanted this job. She had needed it. The Mafia boss hadn't smiled in 10 years. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, all Eliana knew was that her mother's boutique florist shop in Brooklyn was 3 months behind on rent, that the landlord had left a final notice taped to the glass door yesterday morning, and that a mysterious black card client had wired $40,000 into her business account with a single line of instruction: floral arrangements for the Ferraro Costa wedding, delivery by 6, discretion above all. She had not asked questions. Women who ran struggling flower shops in Brooklyn did not ask questions when $40,000 appeared like a miracle in a starving account. They said yes. They loaded the van. They showed up. If you love dark mafia romance, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your city in the comments so I know where you're watching from tonight. What Eliana had not expected when she arrived at the cathedral with her crates of peonies and trailing ivy was to see him, standing in the vestibule with a clipboard in one hand and a Bluetooth earpiece screwed into his ear, dressed in a slate gray suit tailored a half size too tight the way he always liked, was Marcus Whitfield, her ex-boss, her ex-boyfriend, the smug high-end event planner who had fired her from his firm 2 years ago after telling her, in front of an entire staff meeting, that no bride wanted a whale arranging her centerpieces. Eliana felt her stomach drop straight through the marble floor. She thought about turning around. She thought about walking out. She thought about the $40,000 and the eviction notice and her mother's shop, and she made herself keep walking. Marcus spotted her before she could hide. His mouth curled into that thin, familiar smile that used to make her feel small in her own skin, and he detached himself from a group of harried assistants and crossed the vestibule with the loose, arrogant stride of a man who believed the world had been designed as his personal runway. He looked her up and down with the slow, deliberate cruelty of someone who wanted her to feel it. His eyes lingered on her hips, her chest, her flushed cheeks, and he clicked his tongue softly the way a person might click at a badly behaved dog. "Eliana," he said, drawing the syllables out like he was tasting them. "I didn't realize we were letting you back into events. Someone must have been truly desperate." "I was booked directly," Eliana said, keeping her voice level even as her hands began to shake around the stems of the peonies. "I have the contract. I'm just here to deliver the arrangements and set the aisle runner." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his overpriced cologne and the underlying sourness of a man who drank too much espresso. "You look like a stuffed olive in that dress," he murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear. "I hope you brought a real florist to actually finish the work, because you certainly won't be walking anywhere near the guests looking like that." Eliana's throat tightened. She did not answer. She had learned, over 3 years of dating Marcus Whitfield, that answering only extended the cruelty. But Marcus was not finished. He glanced down at his clipboard, made a theatrical sighing sound, and then looked back up at her with something dangerous glinting in his pale eyes. "Actually," he said slowly, "we have a problem. The bride's cousin, the flower girl Walker, just called out with food poisoning. We need someone to scatter petals down the aisle before the processional. And since you're already here, and since you're already being paid an obscene fee, you're going to do it." Eliana stared at him. "Marcus, I'm the florist. I'm not dressed. I'm not." "You're wearing a dress, aren't you?" he interrupted, his smile widening into something almost gleeful. "Consider it part of the contract. Or don't. And I'll personally make sure every event planner between here and Philadelphia knows your name by Monday morning." She understood, then, exactly what he was doing. He wanted to parade her curves down that aisle in front of 400 of New York's cruelest, most judgmental elites. He wanted to see her humiliated. He wanted to watch her trip on her own trembling ankles in front of women who wore couture and men who owned skyscrapers. And he wanted to laugh about it later over cocktails at some rooftop bar, where the drinks cost more than her monthly rent. Eliana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back savagely, because she would not, cry in front of Marcus Whitfield. She lifted her chin. She tightened her grip on the basket of white peony petals that had been thrust into her hands. And she said, quietly, fine. Marcus grinned. From the sanctuary beyond the vestibule, the string quartet began to tune their instruments, and somewhere in the front pew, a man Eliana had never seen was about to look up at the wrong moment and change the course of both of their lives forever. The organ swelled into the opening bars of Pachelbel's canon, and the heavy oak doors of the cathedral groaned open on their ancient hinges. Eliana stood at the threshold clutching her basket of white peony petals, her knees quietly betraying her beneath the sage silk of her dress. 400 faces turned. 400 pairs of eyes, sharpened by champagne and old money and the peculiar cruelty of people who had never in their lives worried about rent, swept over her in one collective assessment and found her wanting. She heard the whisper start immediately, a low, rustling murmur that rolled through the pews like wind through dry leaves. Who is that? Is that the flower girl? Isn't she a bit? Someone laughed. Someone else shushed the laugh, but not before it reached Eliana's ears, and her cheeks bloomed a hot, humiliated crimson beneath her carefully powdered makeup. She made herself walk, one foot in front of the other, scattering petals with a trembling hand, keeping her eyes fixed on the flickering candles at the altar so she would not have to see the smirks in the pews. She did not know that in the front row on the groom's side, a man was watching her with an expression that had not crossed his face in 10 years. Dante Ferraro was 38 years old, and the New York underworld had a nickname for him that no one dared say to his face. They called him the Ice King. His hair was obsidian black shot through with silver at the temples, cut short and severe. His jaw was carved from something harder than granite. His eyes were the color of a storm gathering over the Hudson in November, gray shading toward black, and they had not looked at anything in a decade with anything that resembled warmth. He sat in the front pew in a bespoke midnight blue three-piece suit that had been hand-stitched in Naples, his gloved hands folded on his knee, his mouth a flat line that neither smiled nor frowned nor moved at all. 10 years ago, on a wet spring afternoon in Little Italy, a car bomb meant for him had killed his young wife Sophia while she carried groceries up to their brownstone. He had held her in the street until the sirens came. He had buried her on a Tuesday. And on the Wednesday he had woken up and walked into a warehouse in Red Hook and personally ended the 4 men responsible. And after that he had never touched a woman, never laughed at a joke, never smiled at a christening or a birthday or a wedding. Not once, not for anyone. Not in 10 years. His younger brother Nico was getting married today, and Dante had come only because their mother Antonella had asked him to, and Antonella Ferraro was the one person on earth Dante Ferraro would not refuse. He had planned to sit through the ceremony, kiss his mother's cheek, shake his brother's hand, and be back in his townhouse on Fifth Avenue before the reception band played its first note. He had planned. And then the doors at the back of the cathedral had opened, and a woman he had never seen before had begun walking down the aisle with a basket of white peony petals trembling in her hands, and something in Dante Ferraro's chest had gone very quiet and very still. She was not what these people wanted. He could see it immediately. He could see it in the way the Colombo wives leaned toward each other behind their fans, in the way a young banker in the third row elbowed his date and snickered. She was soft where they wanted hard, generous where they wanted starved, warm where they wanted cold. Her dark curls were slipping loose from their pins. Her cheeks were flushed. Her hands were shaking so badly that petals were falling in clumps instead of graceful drifts. And she was, Dante realized with the slow dawning quiet of a man discovering something he had not believed still existed, the most beautiful thing he had seen in 10 years. She got halfway down the aisle before it happened. Her left heel, thin and inexperienced on her foot, because she was a florist and not a woman who wore heels, caught on the edge of the white silk aisle runner. Her ankle turned. Her basket flew. Her body pitched forward with the helpless slow-motion certainty of a fall that could not be stopped, and a soft cry escaped her throat, and 400 people inhaled at once. Dante Ferraro moved before he had decided to move. He was out of the pew in a single fluid motion, his gloved hands catching her under the arms just before her knees hit the marble, hauling her upright against his chest with the effortless strength of a man who had lifted bodies for a living long before he wore Neapolitan suits. Peonies rained down around them, white petals falling through the candlelight like snow, and Eliana Russo looked up into the face of a man she had never seen and felt the entire cathedral disappear. His eyes were the color of storms. His hand was splayed wide and warm across the small of her back. He was not letting go, not yet, not quite yet, and she could feel his heart beating against her breastbone, slow and steady and shockingly alive. "I'm sorry," she whispered, mortified, her voice cracking around the syllables. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, And then Dante Ferraro, the Ice King of Manhattan, the man who had not smiled in 10 years, looked down at the trembling flower girl in his arms and smiled. It was slow. It was small. It was devastating. Somewhere behind him, his capo Luca Bianchi dropped his rosary onto the marble floor with an audible clatter. In the second pew, an old maid man named Vincenzo actually crossed himself. Antonella Ferraro, seated 3 feet away in black lace, brought one gloved hand to her mouth and let out a soft sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a prayer. The whispers that had been mocking Eliana a moment ago died in 400 throats simultaneously, replaced by a silence so complete that Eliana could hear the candles burning. Dante's thumb, still gloved in soft black leather, brushed a single stray peony petal from her collarbone with the reverence of a man touching a relic. "Don't apologize, Piccola Fiore," he murmured, and his voice was gravel wrapped in dark velvet, low enough that only she could hear it. "You just did something no one has managed in 10 years. Eliana did not remember the rest of the ceremony. She remembered Dante Ferraro setting her back on her feet with the same careful precision a man might use to set down a piece of blown glass. She remembered him bending to retrieve her basket, gathering the fallen peonies with those large gloved hands and pressing them back into her arms, as though he were returning her crown. She remembered the way he had not stepped back, not immediately, the way his storm-gray eyes had held hers for one heartbeat too long, before he inclined his head half an inch and murmured, "Walk, Piccola. Finish your aisle. I will be watching." And so she had walked, on legs made of water, scattering the last of the petals in a daze, while 400 guests stared not at her, but at the man who had just caught her, because every single one of them had seen him smile and every single one of them understood that the world had just tilted several degrees on its axis. The bride Amara came down the aisle in a cloud of Vera Wong tulle. The vows were exchanged. Nico Ferraro kissed his new wife. The recessional played. And through all of it, Dante Ferraro did not sit down. He stood in the front pew with his hands folded behind his back, and he watched Eliana, where she had been quietly directed to stand at the side of the sanctuary. And every time she dared glance up, she found those eyes waiting for her, patient and unblinking, and she felt her stomach flutter in a way she had not felt in years, and possibly had never felt all. She tried to slip away the moment the recessional ended. She gathered her empty basket and slid behind a marble pillar and made for the side corridor that led back to the flower prep room, hoping that if she moved quickly enough, she could pack her crates and be gone before anyone in that congregation remembered her existence. She almost made it. She had crossed the prep room threshold and set her basket down on the counter and was reaching for her coat when the door swung open behind her, and Marcus Whitfield stepped inside and closed it with a soft, deliberate click. "You," he said, and his voice was shaking with a fury she had never quite heard from him before, not even in their worst fights. "You clumsy, embarrassing, fat little." He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her wrist, so hard she felt the small bones grind together. Eliana yelped. "Do you have any idea?" Marcus hissed, his face inches from hers. "Do you have any idea what you just did out there? You made a spectacle. You fell into a guest. Not just any guest, Eliana. That was..." He cut himself off, his eyes wild, and he shook her wrist for emphasis. "Every event planner in this cathedral saw you. Every single one. Your name is done. You hear me? Done. I'm docking your fee to 0. I'm calling my contacts tonight. You will never work another wedding in this city. You fat, clumsy, embarrassing. He shoved her back against the marble counter. Her hip struck the edge hard enough to bruise. Tears spilled over her lashes before she could stop them, hot and humiliated. And she hated herself for crying in front of him almost as much as she hated him for making her. Please, she whispered, please, Marcus, I just want to go home. He laughed. It was an ugly sound. Go home, he mimicked. Go home in that dress. Look at yourself. The seams are screaming. You should be grateful any man ever touched you. You should be on your knees thanking me for the years I wasted pretending you were worth. Enough. The word was not spoken loudly. It did not need to be. It fell across the room like a blade dropped onto marble, and Marcus Whitfield went entirely still, and Eliana felt the temperature of the air drop several degrees. In the doorway, framed by the dim gold light of the corridor, stood Dante Ferraro. He had not moved. He was not moving now. His gloved hands were folded loosely in front of him. His face was carved from something that no longer resembled granite, so much as it resembled a mountain that had decided to become weather. His eyes were fixed on the place where Marcus's fingers were still clamped around Eliana's wrist. If Marcus Whitfield had been a smarter man, or a sober man, or simply a man with better instincts, he might have released her immediately and dropped to his knees and begged. But Marcus was not any of those things. Marcus was a man who planned weddings for New York's ultra-wealthy, and that meant Marcus knew exactly whose brother had just gotten married in that cathedral, and the recognition that had been slow to reach his brain arrived now all at once. The color drained from his face in a visible wave, from his hairline down to his collar, and his knees actually buckled beneath him. His fingers sprang open around Eliana's wrist, as though her skin had burned him. Mr. Ferraro, Marcus stammered, and his voice cracked in the middle of the name. Mr. Ferraro, this is a misunderstanding. This woman and I have a professional history. I was simply. If Marcus is already getting what he deserves, smash that like button. Subscribe for more Mafia revenge stories. And let me know in the comments which city you're watching from right now. Dante did not answer him. Dante crossed the flower prep room with the slow, silent grace of an apex predator that had already decided how the next several seconds were going to end, and was simply choosing the most elegant path. Eliana stepped back against the counter, her hand pressed to her bruised wrist, and watched him come. He did not look at her. He looked at Marcus. He stopped 6 inches away from Marcus's face, and he bent his head down until his lips were an inch from Marcus's ear, and he spoke. Eliana could not hear the words. She would never know exactly what Dante Ferraro whispered to Marcus Whitfield in that flower prep room in the basement of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral on that October afternoon. She only knew that Marcus made a small strangled sound, and that his knees gave out entirely, and that a dark stain bloomed across the front of his expensive gray trousers before he could stop it. Dante straightened. He adjusted his cuffs with the same unhurried precision a surgeon might use to adjust his gloves. He turned to Eliana, his storm gray eyes softened just slightly at the corners. He extended one gloved hand toward her, palm up, waiting. Come, Piccola, he said quietly. You are dining at my table tonight. Eliana looked down at his open hand. She looked at Marcus, who was on his knees now, weeping soundlessly, his forehead pressed against the marble floor. She looked back at Dante, at those patient waiting eyes, and she understood with a sudden bright clarity that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and that the next thing she did would define the rest of her life. She thought of her mother's flower shop. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of the way this man had caught her when she fell, and had not laughed, and had not let go until she was steady. She lifted her hand. She placed it into his. His gloved fingers closed gently around hers, warm and absolute, and he drew her past the kneeling ruin of Marcus Whitfield and out into the corridor, without ever once looking back. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been transformed for the Ferraro-Costa reception into something that looked less like a wedding venue, and more like the private drawing room of a 19th-century Venetian doge. 20,000 white roses had been flown in from Ecuador that morning. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars threw fractured light across a black marble dance floor. 400 guests in couture and diamonds moved through the space in careful, whispering clusters, and every single one of them turned when the mahogany doors swung open and Dante Ferraro walked in with a plus-size florist on his arm. Eliana felt the room go still around her the way a forest goes still when a wolf steps into a clearing. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could feel the weight of 400 stares landing on her sage green work dress, on her slipping chignon, on the peony petal still caught somewhere in her hair. But she could also feel Dante's gloved hand resting steady on the small of her back, his fingers spread wide and possessive, and the message that hand was sending to the room was so absolute that no one in that ballroom dared to whisper a word. Women who had smirked at her in the cathedral pews an hour ago now studied the floral centerpieces with fierce concentration. A hedge fund manager who had elbowed his date and laughed at Eliana's fall was standing very still by the bar, sweating through his tuxedo shirt, unable to make himself turn around. Dante did not walk her to a corner table. He did not walk her to the back of the room where a nervous florist might be politely stashed for the duration of the meal. He walked her straight down the center of the ballroom, past the string quartet, past the ice sculpture of the Ferraro family crest, past 3 tables of state senators and 1 table of federal judges, all the way to the raised family dais at the head of the room. Antonella Ferraro was already seated in her place of honor, dressed in floor-length black lace with a single strand of pearls at her throat and her white hair pinned into an old-fashioned twist. She watched her eldest son approach with those same sharp black eyes she had used to run a household of dangerous men for 40 years. And when Dante stopped in front of her and quietly said, "Mama, this is Eliana," Antonella Ferraro did something that made the entire family table lean forward in shock. She reached across the white linen and took Eliana's trembling hand between both of hers, and she squeezed. And she said in soft, accented English, "Sit here, cara mia, next to me. You will eat. You are too pale." Eliana sat. Dante took the chair on her other side. A waiter appeared from nowhere and set a crystal glass of champagne in front of her with hands that shook slightly, because the waiter had been working at the plaza for 11 years, and he had never once served a woman seated at the right hand of Dante Ferraro. Antonella patted Eliana's wrist, the same wrist Marcus had bruised an hour earlier, and murmured in Italian to her son, "Finalmente. He looks alive again." And Dante, without taking his eyes off Eliana's face, murmured back in the same soft Italian, "Sai mama." I know. The courses began to arrive. Burrata flown from Puglia that morning. Handmade tortellini in brown butter and sage. Wild sea bass in a saffron broth. Eliana, who had not eaten anything since a piece of toast at 6 that morning, discovered that her hands were shaking too badly to hold her fork properly. Dante noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. He leaned toward her and quietly, without making a spectacle, cut a small piece of the sea bass on her plate and slid it back toward her fork. And he said low against her ear, "Eat piccola. You are safe here. No one at this table will judge a single bite you take. I promise you that." She looked at him. He was so close she could see the faint silver at his temples, the small scar at the corner of his jaw, the way his storm-gray eyes had gone soft in a way she suspected almost no one alive had ever seen them go soft. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. He considered the question for a long moment before he answered. "Because for 10 years," he said finally, "I have walked into rooms and felt nothing. And then this afternoon a woman fell into my arms, and I felt something. I am not a man who ignores such things. I do not know yet what you are to me, Eliana Russo, but I know that I am not letting you walk out of this hotel tonight without knowing your address. And I know that I am not letting anyone in this room, or in this city, ever speak to you again the way that man spoke to you in the basement." She did not know what to say to that. So she picked up her fork and she ate the sea bass, and it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted in her life. For the next 2 hours, Dante Ferraro asked her questions. He asked about her flower shop. He asked about her mother, who had died 4 years ago of pancreatic cancer. He asked about the specific varietal of peony she had chosen for the aisle, and when she stammered an answer about a Japanese cultivar called Shimanishiki, he nodded gravely, as though she had just explained something of profound importance. He refilled her champagne. He translated the Italian toasts. He introduced her to his younger brother Nico, who kissed her hand and grinned at Dante with the delighted disbelief of a man watching a miracle in progress. He introduced her to his cousin Sophia's widower, an old capo named Enzo, who studied Eliana with wet dark eyes for a long moment, and then squeezed Dante's shoulder and murmured something in Italian that made Dante swallow hard and nod once. Eliana felt, for the first time in her adult life, like the most important woman in a room full of women who had been raised to be important. She did not feel like a florist. She did not feel like a plus-size afterthought. She did not feel like the woman Marcus Whitfield had spent 3 years telling her she was. She felt like something else entirely, something she did not yet have a word for. And every time Dante's gloved hand brushed her wrist or her sleeve or the curve of her shoulder, the word came a little closer to arriving. Halfway through dessert, a slice of dark chocolate torte with candied orange. Luca Bianchi appeared at Dante's shoulder. He bent down. He whispered something in rapid Sicilian into Dante's ear. Eliana watched Dante's face flicker, watched the warmth drain from his eyes, and something colder and older take its place, and then watched him smooth his expression back into something gentle before he turned to her. He took her hand. He pressed it briefly to his lips, gloves and all. "Forgive me, Piccola," he said quietly. "A small matter of business. I will return before the dancing begins. Do not leave this table. My mother will keep you company." He rose. He kissed his mother's cheek. He walked out of the ballroom with Luca at his shoulder, and Eliana, watching him go, did not know that in 3 different boroughs of New York, at that exact moment, the entire life of Marcus Whitfield was already beginning to burn to the ground. Marcus Whitfield did not sleep that night. He drove home from the cathedral in a fog of shame and panic, changed out of his ruined trousers in the dark, and sat on the edge of his bed in his Chelsea walk-up staring at his phone, waiting for a call that would tell him this had all been a misunderstanding. The call did not come. What came instead, at 3:17 in the morning, was an email from his corporate credit card company informing him that all 4 of his lines had been frozen pending an urgent internal review. At 6, his personal banker in Midtown called to tell him that his checking account had been placed under a federal hold. At 7:45, 2 men in dark suits with IRS credentials knocked on the door of Whitfield and Vale Events and served the receptionist with a warrant citing 6 years of misfiled income from cash-only bookings. By 9, an anonymous shell company registered in Delaware had bought out Marcus's majority investor overnight for cash, and by 10, that shell company had removed Marcus Whitfield as chief executive by written resolution. His fiancée Blair, a Hamptons real estate heiress, whose father did significant business with the Ferraro family, called off the engagement at 11:15 in a phone call she took loudly in the dining room of the Yale Club so that 6 of her father's business associates could hear every word. At noon, every major venue in Manhattan quietly stopped answering Marcus's emails. At 1:30, TMZ published a data dump of a decade of Marcus's private messages to female employees, servers, and dates, sourced anonymously from a hard drive no forensic team would ever be able to trace. His mother stopped taking his calls at 2. His doorman turned him away from his own condo at 4, citing a lease violation that had been discovered that morning. And by 6 in the evening, Marcus Whitfield was standing on a curb outside a bodega on 9th Avenue with a duffel bag at his feet, holding a phone that would no longer accept incoming or outgoing calls, weeping in a way he had not wept since he was a child. Eliana knew none of this. Eliana woke up at 10 in the morning in a guest suite of a Ferraro-owned townhouse on 5th Avenue because Dante had refused to let her take a taxi home after Champagne, and had instead pressed a key card into her hand and murmured that the 3rd floor was hers for as long as she needed it, and that his housekeeper Rosa would bring her breakfast whenever she rang. Eliana had rung at 10:15. Rosa had brought fresh cornetti and espresso, and a folded note on cream cardstock, and a garment box. The box was long and flat and tied with a heavy black silk ribbon. Eliana untied it with trembling fingers. Inside, folded in layers of tissue paper the color of storm clouds, was a floor-length gown in deep sapphire velvet, cut for her exact measurements by an atelier whose label she did not recognize, but whose stitching she understood immediately to be worth more than her yearly rent. The neckline was a soft sweetheart that would celebrate her chest rather than compress it. The waist was fitted with the precision of a corset, without any of the cruelty. The skirt fell in heavy liquid folds designed to move around her hips instead of hiding them. Tucked into the bodice was the note. The handwriting was slanted and elegant and unmistakably Italian. A queen does not walk in wilted petals. Dinner, 8 o'clock. My driver will collect you. D. At 8 o'clock precisely, a matte black Bentley pulled up in front of the townhouse. At 8:22, Eliana stepped out of that Bentley in front of a restaurant on the Upper East Side called Daniel, and the maitre d' bowed slightly at the waist and led her, without a word, to a private dining room on the second floor. Dante Ferraro was standing at the window when she walked in. He was dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit with a black silk tie, and when he turned and saw her, he stood so abruptly that his chair scraped the marble floor. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He cupped her face with both hands, unloved now, warm bare skin against her cheeks for the first time, and he murmured, Dio mio, you will unmake me, piccola. Over dinner, he told her about Sofia. He told her about the car bomb, about the wet spring pavement, about the 4 men in the Red Hook warehouse. He told her about 10 years of silence. He told her about walking into that cathedral believing he would never feel anything again, and about the woman with flour on her hands and peonies in her arms who had fallen against his chest and cracked something he had believed to be permanently frozen. He told her that he did not do half measures. He told her that if she wanted to walk away tonight, he would respect it. He would pay her rent for 5 years. He would never contact her again. But if she stayed, he said, his storm gray eyes locked on hers, if she stayed, she became his queen. The world would reorganize itself around her safety. No one would ever speak to her the way Marcus Whitfield had spoken to her. No one would ever touch her wrist the way Marcus Whitfield had touched her wrist. He would build a garden around her that no living man would ever dare to trample. Eliana opened her mouth to answer. She never got the chance. The maitre d' burst through the private dining room door with sweat on his forehead. A disturbance downstairs, he stammered. A man. Drunk. He bribed the doorman. He is coming up, they. Marcus Whitfield staggered into the room. His suit was filthy. His hair was wild. His eyes were red and unfocused, and when they landed on Eliana in her sapphire velvet gown seated across from Dante Ferraro at a candlelit table, something in his face broke apart entirely. You, he screamed, and he lunged forward 2 steps before he caught himself. You ruined me. You fat, gold-digging. You took everything from me, you witch, you. Dante did not stand. He did not shout. He raised one finger. Luca Bianchi and Rocco Marchetti materialized from the shadows of the corridor, as though they had been waiting there the entire evening, which of course they had been, and they lifted Marcus off the floor by his elbows before he could take a 3rd step. Marcus's feet dangled 6 inches above the marble. Dante finally looked up. His storm gray eyes were now pure black. You are alive right now, Marcus, he said quietly, because she has a soft heart. Not because you deserve breath. If her name ever crosses your lips again, if her address ever appears in your search history, if a single one of your remaining acquaintances so much as whispers her name at a bar, the Hudson will keep what is left of you, and no one will look for the rest. Do you understand me? Marcus made a sound that was not a word. Luca and Rocco carried him out. The door closed. The candles flickered once and steadied. Dante turned back to Eliana. The black drained slowly out of his eyes, and the gray came back, and then something softer than gray, something almost silver. He pushed his chair back. He knelt beside hers, actually knelt, on the marble floor of one of the most expensive restaurants in New York, and he took her hand and pressed it flat against his chest so she could feel his heartbeat pounding underneath the fine wool of his suit. 10 years, piccola fiori, he said, and his voice was rough. 10 years, I did not feel this. Stay. Let me build a garden around you that no one can ever trample. Let me be the man who catches you every time you fall. Eliana looked down at him, at the Ice King of Manhattan on his knees on a marble floor with her hand pressed to his heart. She thought of her mother's shop. She thought of the eviction notice that would never come now. She thought of the way this man had smiled at her in a cathedral for the first time in 10 years. She leaned down. She kissed him. Outside on Fifth Avenue, the first snow of the season began to fall over Manhattan, slow and quiet and white, drifting past the restaurant windows like scattered peony petals. The Ice King had thawed, and the underworld, from that night forward, would never be cold enough to freeze him again. If this story gave you chills, please hit that like button, subscribe for more dark mafia romance uploaded every week, and drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from tonight.